Welcome to Around Kitsap. I'm Shar Burnett. Joining me in the studio today is David Greetham. David is an environmental planner with the Department of Community Development in Kitsap County. Welcome, David.
Good afternoon, Shoreline.
We're here to talk about the Shoreline Master Program Update.
That's right.
Is that right?
That's
Shoreline
right.
Master Program Update.
That's right.
Which is a huge undertaking by Kitsap County, as well as City of Bremerton, City of Port Orchard, City of Paulsbo, City of Bainbridge Island. David, explain to us why this Master Program Update, who mandates it, why is it important?
Okay. Well, first let's talk about what the Shoreline Master Program is.
Perfect.
It's the county's code that deals with development within 200 feet of the ordinary high water mark of the shorelines. So in Kitsap County, in unincorporated Kitsap County, that means 216 miles of saltwater shorelines, about 55 miles of lake shoreline, and about 22 miles of stream shoreline. And there are actually smaller lakes, less than 20 acres in size, and streams less than 20 cubic feet per second of flow that are not regulated by this, because those aren't large enough to be shorelines of the state. Okay. So again, we're dealing with lakes greater than 20 acres, streams over 20 cubic feet per second of flow. That's about 7 streams in the county, the larger ones, and all of our marine shorelines. So the master program guides development activities both on the water and within 200 feet of it. And this is based on the Shoreline Management Act that was passed in 1972.
By the state.
By the state. The Shoreline Master Program is each city or county's local program that carries out that act that was passed 40 years ago.
How often do you have to do an update?
Well, before 2003, updates weren't necessarily mandated on a certain schedule, but Kitsap County's first local program was adopted in 1976, last updated in 1999. However, in 2003, the state legislature passed new rules called the guidelines for each city and county that has shorelines in the state, that's 261 total, to update their local shoreline master program. And that 2003 set of guidelines also had a schedule for each of those 261 cities and counties. Kitsap County is on schedule to update by the end of 2012.
Along with our cities?
In the cities as well.
The cities as well.
That's correct.
Okay.
And the guidelines had some pretty stringent new requirements. The 2003 guidelines included the requirement to demonstrate that our new regulations on the shoreline, or updated regulations, can demonstrate no net loss of existing shoreline functions. So in other words, we're to accommodate public access, appropriate shoreline development, water-dependent uses, but also show that those are not resulting in harm to our shoreline. In other words, the baseline from when this is adopted moving forward, that is our baseline, and we have to show no harm to the shoreline from that point forward. That's called no net loss. So that's a term you'll hear with regard to these updates that are going on. And to demonstrate that, we're both updating goals, policies, and regulations, but we're also doing a cumulative impact assessment, and I'll provide a reference to that on our website shortly.
Wow.
And also a restoration plan. The restoration plan indicates various projects that are voluntary, but those help get to that balance of no net loss, because all development results in some impact. But with the restoration plan and our updated policies, goals, and regulations, we hope to achieve that balance that the state is looking for with the new rules.
So the program update has to be completed by the end of 2012, but when did you begin this piece of work?
You bet. We began in 2009. The slide we're looking at shows the climbing man, and the climbing man is basically going up the stairs that each city and county has to go through for this process. So Kitsap County is basically on a 2009 through 2012 timeline.
Okay.
Now that doesn't mean the State Department of Ecology, who eventually has to give final approval to each of these 261 plans we're talking about, will be done in 2012. But the county's effort should be done by the end of 2012. That's the schedule we're on. So in 2009, we started with something called a shoreline jurisdiction determination. What lakes, streams, and shorelines are we talking about? We've just gone over those. Then we went into a shoreline inventory and characterization. Let's inventory all of our existing conditions. And why is that important? Because the last inventory, which was significantly less in the amount of information provided, was in the mid-70s when the first program was adopted. We've got much better mapping, probably double the population, and all sorts of natural resource information provided by state agencies we didn't have at that time to inventory existing shorelines. So the county undertook an inventory by walking all the shorelines, both in East Sound and on Hood Canal, and that resulted in inventory and characterization. That's the foundation for moving forward with our updated regulations.
David, do you know if there's any other county in our state that has more shoreline than us?
We hear the San Juans Probably compete with us.
yeah, yeah,
Now King
that makes
County
sense.
might jump out ahead, but they have mostly riverine systems. They have some very large riverine systems that are over that 20 cubic feet per second of flow that qualify as shoreline. So they have a large volume of riverine miles. For marine shorelines, we're up there. We're up there.
How many folks in the Department of Community Development have been working on the Shoreline Master Program update?
We've typically had a team of 2 staff, and then that's been aided by a very dedicated citizens task force. In
Nice.
2010, the Board of Commissioners appointed a 20-member citizens task force that included shoreline property owners, interested college students,
Good.
folks representing environmental organizations, property rights organizations, and some folks from the industry, the aquaculture industry. And that group worked very hard for 2 years to advise us on the draft mapping we're going to talk about and goals and
Excellent.
policies.
Very good. Very good. Good citizen engagement.
Yes, very much.
But we need folks to be more engaged. So, David, what major changes to the Shoreline Master Program update are being considered?
Well, the first one, and we're looking at a slide right now that shows the 6 shoreline environment designations. These are new. The 2003 rules we mentioned a few minutes ago have some recommended designations. We don't have to stick just to these. Certain jurisdictions have expanded and added a few of their own. We found that we generally fit within these 6. Aquatic includes everything below the ordinary high water mark, which is where the upland meets the beach. And then in the upland, we have natural, rural conservancy, urban conservancy, shoreline residential, and high intensity. And those designations on the map that we're looking at, this is a draft map for Central Kitsap, direct how intensive the uses and activities can be in those portions of the shoreline. So for example, on the far west shoreline, southwest corner of the county on the canal, we've got natural. We've got a lot of very high slope areas, intact native vegetation, very low tolerance for new development activities because of the steepness of the slopes. Those are going to tend to be on the natural shoreline end of things. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, downtown Silverdale, high intensity. It's developed, it's commercial, it's intended for high intensity uses. Somewhere in between, you have the conservancies. The rural conservancy tends to be those areas in the rural areas outside of the cities, or the urban growth areas and the cities, that have some limitations, steep slopes, floodplains, but they're still developable. You just have to respect those limitations. So you can have slightly larger buffers. Inside the urban areas, you also have some sensitive lands, such as the Clear Creek Estuary in Silverdale and Buckland Hill Road. That's in the urban growth boundary, so that's going to be called urban conservancy. The remaining areas are shoreline residential, and those are just what they sound like. They're fairly heavily developed. They might have some minor slopes, but they're fairly heavily developed. They've established a dense pattern of development and not a lot of environmental restrictions on those shoreline residential areas.
How do you keep all those terms straight in your head?
Well,
Acronyms and
it took a lot of reading and working with this stuff,
Yeah.
and spending some time with our task force.
will existing vegetation conservation buffer and building setback requirements change?
They will. I mentioned that the first program, local program, was done in the mid-70s. Since that time, we've got a lot better information, aerial photos, development patterns, and better information at what functions vegetation provides on the shoreline. So now is our opportunity to really identify the areas where buffers might need to be a little larger. We talked about natural a few minutes ago. Those buffers would go up. Shoreline residential buffers would actually go down under the new program because those areas have already established a pattern of fairly heavy development. And it doesn't make sense to have a 100 or 130 foot buffer in an area where you've got homes in maybe the 85 foot range, very generally. So we're taking this opportunity to really update our environment mapping on the shorelines. And we're also, in addition to that, taking the opportunity to identify 16 major development uses and activities that occur along the shoreline. And the guidelines, the rules that we talked about, sort of identify these as agriculture, aquaculture, on down the line. We've grouped them into about 16 main activities. And this program will also have special requirements for each of those activities to both accommodate those appropriate uses, but also, again, get to that no net loss of existing shoreline functions. How do we get to that balance? And that's what we've been striving for in this update.
Excellent. So if regulations change, will existing homes and yards be conforming?
They will. This has been an issue of some controversy. The legislature recognized that controversy. The concern was that if shoreline master programs are updated and buffers increase, what about the homes that were inside those buffers? Do they become non-conforming? The legislature passed a bill allowing local jurisdictions working on these updates to elect to call all existing homes conforming. And the Board of Commissioners elected to go that route. So we've laid out in this draft that all existing homes, yards, your existing yard and garden, driveway, they're all conforming. This applies to new development activities.
Development.
Exactly, that's the key. This applies to new development activity within the shoreline. We have a slide here showing some homes on the Miller Bay Spit, and this demonstrates exactly why we've taken that route. Almost every lot is developed. However, they certainly wouldn't meet current setback requirements. They're probably 25 to 50 feet. And under our current proposal for shoreline residential, we'd be in the 50 to 85 foot range. We have determined those are all existing, conforming, legally established uses. New development activities would need to strive to meet the new requirements, and if they can't, they might need a variance, which there is a process for. We're also addressing shoreline armoring, known as bulkheading.
I thought that maybe, is that hard armoring?
That's
is what
called hard
you're
armoring,
targeting?
yeah.
It means the bulkhead
Right.
situations.
Bulkheads are the common term.
Yeah,
That's right.
many people sensitive to that. Many people have them.
That's right, because we have some very active storm systems in the Puget Sound, and they can quickly erode away an existing yard. That is recognized. So bulkheads are not prohibited. However, the legislature has more clearly defined when they're permitted. And as part of these rules that we're dealing with, they've identified imminent risk is the key term we're looking at when determining whether a new bulkhead is appropriate. So typically when somebody proposes a bulkhead to protect an existing home, they'll hire a geologist. That geologist needs to identify whether there's an imminent risk to that structure. And what that means is within 3 years. That's something new. The rules identify imminent risk as being a threat within 3 years. If that's been established, then we start at the least impacting bulkhead called soft armoring. And that's typically, we have a slide here showing logs that are, you can't see the anchors, but they're anchored into the shoreline. In some cases those work. And you back them with deep-rooted vegetation and maybe a few rocks strewn around. That's called soft armoring.
Nice.
That won't work in all of our shorelines.
Right.
In some cases, we have high energy wave environments and you'd need a hard wall. But your geotechnical report needs to demonstrate that first. Now, I also want to point out that existing bulkheads are recognized and repair and maintenance activities are allowed on existing bulkheads. Typically, if you're repairing or replacing greater than 50%, we get into the new rules. If it's up to 50%, it's considered repair and replacement or repair and maintenance.
Excellent. Will docks and other mooring structures be allowed?
They will.
Continue to be allowed, I should say.
They will. Those are a water-dependent use, and there's a real focus in the guidelines on water-dependent uses and activities. The focus from our task force is let's try to limit the proliferation of individual docks where we can and focus folks on either joint use, that means a shared, or community docks where we can.
Great,
So there's a focus on that in the updated program. There's also a focus, to get to that no net loss again, to balance dock installation with protection of the critical saltwater habitats that we're dealing with below the surface. Eelgrass, things like that, certain types of habitats. And we have a slide here that shows the new style of dock you're seeing over the last 10 or 20 years. And instead of the old parallel piers marching out, you have what they call monopiles, just individual pilings spaced out at least 20 feet. You have grating on the surface of the dock. That allows natural light to penetrate, so you're not shading out eelgrass areas. We've really tried to line up our local dock regulations with the state and federal agency requirements that folks have to go through anyway. The idea is no more surprises. If you come to the county for your dock and then you get your approval and leave, hopefully you'll have met the state and federal requirements at the same time and therefore sped up the process. But again, there's a focus on joint use and community docks where possible, and also limiting the length, if you're in a narrow bay, to not more than 15% of the shore-to-shore distance, or the fetch. That takes into account local recreational uses.
Very, very interesting. It's very important that, number one, if you live on the shoreline in Kitsap County, that you have this information. And David, where can our citizens find more information on the Shoreline Master Program update?
Yes, we've got a dedicated Shoreline Master Program website, kitsapshoreline.org, www.kitsapshoreline.org. And that's where we've really uploaded this information we're talking about. We've recently put a formatted draft that the Planning Commission is going to review in early June. We've also got the cumulative impact assessment report that I mentioned. This is a report that an independent planning firm prepared to demonstrate how our proposed rules will get to that no net loss but still accommodate appropriate shoreline development. We've got our restoration plan attached to the draft document. We've got the draft maps we mentioned. We saw the Central Kitsap map. We've got one for North Kitsap and South Kitsap as well. We've got a complete record of our task force meetings and all the slideshows that went with those as well.
Excellent.
So we really encourage people to go to the website to find this information.
Very important. So when the work gets done at the county level by December, the county will submit to the state.
That's right.
Then the state has, how long do they take to review it? A year or so?
Yeah, and it really depends on the jurisdiction. We know some folks are still dealing with that process, that end process, after a couple of years. Ecology, which is the state agency with the authority to approve or deny these programs and is given that authority by the legislature, has been very involved in our local process. They've had a staff person at our task force meetings. We've tried to stay in touch with ecology to see whether at least we're within the bookends. And we hope that will pay off in the end. We don't know how long it'll take, and ecology may even choose to have an additional public hearing if there are enough controversial issues at that time. If things seem to be generally resolved, they may just review it and either approve or ask for some changes at that time.
One more time, the website for everybody to check it out,
Right.
please.
www.kitsapshoreline.org.
Thanks, David, for coming in. And thanks for joining us around Kitsap. We'll see you next time.